Um, so, being a historian, uh, I find it easiest to talk about the relevance of the Prophet Muhammad's message for our century by going back to the history. And so I'm going to present an interpretation of the Prophet's peacemaking. And we all know that he was forced to defend the Muslim community in Medina from attacks by the pagans in Mecca. But the question is, how does that conflict end? How do you end conflicts? So part of what I'm going to engage in here is a reading of the Surah Al-Fatih, which I translate as the chapter of success in the Quran, chapter 48, which I believe it can be read as a narrative, although of course it is full of praises of God and comments on ethics and so forth. But I think the context of the surah is the return of the early Muslim community to Mecca after having been exiled to Medina for some years. And I should explain that in medieval and classical Muslim commentary on this chapter, there has been a tendency to see it rather as about the peace treaty at Hudaybiyah, which the Prophet concluded sometime before the return to Mecca. I don't entirely why it's read that way, because it talks about being in Batnu Mecca, in the heart of Mecca, which did not happen at Hudaybiyah. And so I think it makes more sense to read it as a narrative of the return to Mecca, and that's how I will read it. So backing up a little bit, there before all these events, the Quran is attentive to how you would make peace with an enemy with whom you're at war. And so the Surah An-Nisa, the Quran 494 says, "Do not say to one who offers you peace, you are not a believer, seeking the spoils of this life, for God has abundant treasure. You used to be like them after all, and then God blessed you." I read this verse to say that, you know, if a party of believers were outside the walls of Medina and came upon a tribal group, for all they know, those are allied with Mecca, and so they would be suspicious of them. And if they are allied with Mecca, then it's legitimate also for them to take booty. But the verse is saying that you shouldn't be so suspicious. This may be a peaceful tribe. It may be people who don't have an alliance with Mecca. And if they offer you peace, then you should accept it from them and avoid a skirmish. So I take from that the lesson that a lot of conflicts are caused by suspicion, by almost a kind of paranoia, an unwillingness to believe in the bona fides of the opponent. And the Quran is cautioning against that mindset. And even in the middle of an overarching conflict, the Quran is interested in peace. So Al-Baqarah, Surah Al-Baqarah, the Cal 2:190 says, "And fight in the way of God with those who fight you, but aggress not. God loves not aggressors." So the point is that is what's being recommended is a defensive battle. It's a just war where one defends oneself. But it seems to me, Of course, this is controversial in the literature, but it seems to me that the Quran, on the whole, forbids aggressive warfare. It's talking about defensive. Of course, if the world gave up offensive warfare, then it would be a paradise compared to what it is. So, and since the verse says that you may fight with those who fight with you, Muslim commentators on the Quran through medieval and into modern history have often argued that the verse implicitly forbids killing non-combatants, including women and children. And this principle is elaborated in the hadith literature and sayings of the caliphs and so forth. But even here in the Quran, it's implied. Unlike most previous historians, I join with the great classicist Glenn Bowersock in seeing the context of these conflicts in the Hijaz and Western Arabia in the early 7th century as the Great War that was then ongoing between the Sasanian Empire in Iran and the Eastern Roman Empire, sometimes called the Byzantine Empire. They called themselves Romans. And in the course of that war, which began in 603 and I believe lasted until early 630, the Quran tilts in favor of Constantinople, in favor of the Eastern Romans, and against the Sasanians. And so in the Surah Rum, in the chapter of Rome, chapter 30, it says, Rome lies vanquished in the nearest province, but in the wake of their defeat, they will triumph after a few years. Before and after, it is God who is in command. On that day, the believers will rejoice in the victory of God. So I interpret this verse to say, first of all, that the Quran evinces a certainty that Rome will triumph in the end, but also that triumph will demonstrate the power of God himself. It seems to me the verses suggest that the Eastern Roman Empire in this conflict has the right on its side, and the early Muslim community appears to have sided so strongly with the Romans that they would see the victory of Constantinople over the Iranians as the victory, as a divine victory. This is, again, not the way the verse has always been read in medieval commentary, but it should be remembered that that the later Muslim empires were often at war with the Byzantine Empire. And so it became, I think, uncomfortable to think that this verse refers to them and to their victory over the Iranians. But that's anachronistic. We can't interpret the verse by later events. At the time, the Sasanians had invaded eastern Anatolia, and they had gone on down into Syria. They took Damascus, and then in 614, they took Jerusalem. And that was an enormous psychological blow to the Christian world of the time, because they had Jerusalem since the Roman Empire gradually adopted Christianity as a state religion under Constantine and his successors. So people in the Roman Near East were bewildered and wondered, have we done something wrong as a collectivity? Have we not practiced our religion correctly? Why has this happened to us? So in the context, this verse seems to me to demonstrate a solidarity of the early community of believers with the Christians, and a critique of the Sasanians. And admit it's a little speculative, but I think it may be partially because the Sasanians were the aggressors. They invaded. They broke previous peace treaties by doing so, and they usurped the territory that had long been in the hands of their enemy, the Near East. Moreover, I think it was probably a little scary to live in those times because the Sasanians might well have come to the Hejaz. They had Yemen. They had taken Yemen in the early 570s, and now they have Jordan and what is now Israel-Palestine. They took Egypt as well. So the Hejaz is surrounded by the Sasanians. And if it's true that the early believers were uncomfortable with these Sasanian aggressions and tilted towards the Christian empire, then they were in a parlous situation. But the Romans did, in fact, come back after long years in which they were defeated time after time and were much the weaker party. In 627, the Roman Emperor Heraclius launched an audacious attack into the heart of the Sasanian Empire through what is now Iraq to Ctesiphon, which was the capital. And by January of 628, he had surrounded Ctesiphon. He didn't take it, but that was seen as a humiliation and a defeat for Khosrow II. I'm showing you a picture of a medieval depiction of Heraclius subordinating Khosrow. Outside of Ctesiphon, Khosrow II had a magnificent palace at Dastagerd, which fell to the Romans and was looted of fine silks and treasure. The Romans, however, could not cross the Tigris. In January, it's the rainy season, and the Tigris was known for being swift-flowing and treacherous. So they didn't have the Iranians blew up the bridge, and so they couldn't cross, or they dismantled the bridge, and so the crown prince in the Sasanian Empire, Sheroye, made a coup against his father and had him executed on February 28, 628. So subsequent commentators have seen this as a vindication of the verse in the Quran predicting that the Romans would ultimately triumph. I should say that the conviction that the Romans would prove victorious in the end was common in this era, and there are other works written in the Byzantine side that say similar things to what the Quran says. One of the earliest commentaries on the Quran by Muqatil bin Suleiman of Balkh alleges that, based on a saying that he traces back to Ikrimah, the son of Abu Sufyan, alleges that the pagans were allied with Iran in this struggle, and the believers tilted towards the Christians. And if this is true, it sheds an entirely different light on those battles that were fought, Badr and Uhud, and the battle of the siege or the trench, the Khandaq, the three major ones which we think are referenced in the Quran, because those then are in a way proxy battles in the greater war between Iran and Rome. And moreover, if all this is true, then as of February of 628, the pagans in the Hejaz had lost their patron because Khosrow II was defeated. Sheroye, having come to the throne, pledges to withdraw from the Near East. So if the pagans did have an alliance with the Iranians, and remember, there was an Iranian garrison nearby in Yemen, then they had been dramatically weakened by early winter of 628. Coming back to the Quran, it has an interesting verse in the Surah of Anfal of the Spoils 861, which says of the enemy, and if they incline to peace, then you should incline to it and put your trust in God. He is the all-hearing, the all-knowing. This seems to me a remarkable verse and a very important one because it underlines my conviction that the wars of the prophet were in defense. Because this principle that if the enemy sues for peace, you should accept the truce, would never be put forward by someone involved in aggressive war. I mean, if one were the aggressor, if you were taking an enemy's towns, wouldn't the town always sue for peace if it's being attacked? And then the aggressor could never actually take anything if he had to accept this entreaty. So I think this principle demonstrates that these were defensive wars, and if the enemy inclined to peace, then the prophet would as well, since the Muslims were the ones who were under attack. So according to the later Muslim tradition, and these are oral traditions that didn't get written down in full until the early Abbasid period in the late 8th century, mid to late 8th century. According to this later literature, in March of 628, Muslims from Medina peacefully set out for pilgrimage to the Kaaba in Mecca, clothed in the clothes of pilgrimage, ihram, which also was a sign of peaceful intent. But they were barred from entering Mecca by the Quraysh army. And rather than risk fighting, and of course, since they had come as pilgrims, a lot of them were not armed. They weren't in a position to fight in any case, but that also wasn't their intent. The prophet agrees to divert to a nearby site at Hudaybiyah and begins negotiations with the Meccans. And the prophet, according to these later narratives, shows extreme flexibility in negotiating with his enemies. So the Meccans deny the right to pilgrimage in 628. They hadn't been prepared for it, but they said they will permit it in the following year, and then they make a peace treaty with the prophet. And as the prophet is dictating the treaty, he says, in the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, this is a treaty of the prophet of God with the Meccans. And the Meccans reject this diction. They said, if we recognized that you were the prophet of God, we wouldn't have been fighting with you in the first place. And so, according to the later stories in the biographies of the prophet then agreed to have it be a treaty between Muhammad ibn Abdullah, his secular name, and the pagans of Mecca. So, and even in these later Muslim tales about this event, it is said that there was discomfort among some of the prophet's followers about this acquiescence in the diction demanded by the other side. So the terms of the Treaty of Hudaybiyah that have come down to us are that there would be no fighting for 10 years, and that people were free to ally with Muhammad or with the Quraysh as they pleased. And so you could have people in Medina who declared for the Quraysh, for the pagans, and you could have people in Mecca who declared for Muhammad. However, the youth would need their father's permission to join Muhammad. And if a minor came to Medina to join the Muslims, that they would be sent back. But if anybody wanted to leave Islam of any age, they could remain in Medina and not be punished for that. Muhammad would postpone entry to Mecca for 1 year. He and his followers may perform a 3-day pilgrimage around Kaaba in 629, but must enter Mecca unarmed. That was those were some of the terms of the treaty, and also it contained a provision that both sides would pledge themselves and their clients to nonviolence towards one another during this 10-year period. I see actually a similarity in some ways between this list of terms in the Treaty of Hudaybiyah and a treaty that was made between the Roman Empire and the Sasanian Empire in the previous century, in the early 560s. There was a similar set of terms about the treatment of defectors and members of the minority religion and so forth. It's possible, it seems to me, that Hudaybiyah was based on these earlier kinds of treaties that were known to be made between Rome and the Sasanians. And if the pagans were in fact Sasanian proxies, that would make a lot of sense. Now and by the way, the historian Al-Tabari, who was writing much later in the 9th century, says that it was at Hudaybiyah that the Prophet received the news of the fall of Khosrow II. So there's my attempt to link these events, the local ones in Hejaz and the greater geostrategic struggle, is not without some internal evidence from the Muslim tradition. Tabari also tells a remarkable story, which is, as far as I know, a little discussed in the literature, that Yemen had been conquered by the Sasanian Iranians in the early 570s by a naval expedition, and the admiral and the officers in the Sasanian military then become kind of a junta. They become a joint ruling group of Yemen. In the next generation, they took local Yemeni wives, and of course it wasn't called Yemen there. It was called Hemyar, but I'm what is now known as Yemen. They took local wives, and it's possible that they heard about Khosrow's defeat and were disheartened. They were out there in the cut off from the Sasanians by the sea. So Tabari says that the Prophet Muhammad sent an emissary and reached out to the chief general of the Iranians. He gives the name as Badan ibn Sasan. That would be in Persian Sasan Zadag. Badan is certainly a corruption. There's some old Persian name behind it. But in any case, Tabari says that the Iranian officers accepted Islam, and that they threw their backing to the Prophet. And it is interesting that the one place that the Zoroastrian religion is mentioned in the Quran, which used to be, the leaders of the religion were called magus or magi, the Greek word for magician, so they were called majus in Arabic. But Al-Hajj 22:17 says the believers, the Jews, the Sabians, the Christians, the Zoroastrians, and the pagans, God will decide among them on the resurrection day. God sees all things. And it's been pointed out by Mahmoud Ayub and other commentators that the Zoroastrians seem to be listed with the monotheistic religions here and not subsumed under the category of the pagans. So it may be part of the prophet's outreach to these Zoroastrians in Yemen that their religion is also being recognized as having some divine origins. In any case, I give this as an example of Islam's soft power in the time of the prophet, that what is now Yemen fell without a shot. It just acceded to the prophet because the Iranian officer corps accepted the prophet's teachings. And there may be a millenarian aspect to this. In Zoroastrianism, there is an expectation of the coming of a promised one, the Saoshyant, at the end of days, who would bring justice. And it's possible, it seems to me, that these Zoroastrians saw Mohammad as that promised one of the Zoroastrian faith. And then in late 629, an unfortunate incident occurred in Mecca where a Quraysh ally, a smaller tribe allied with the Quraysh, attacked a tribe allied with the prophet. And so according to the later Muslim tradition, the early community of believers in Medina considered this to be a violation of the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, because the Meccan pagans didn't rein in their allies, but allowed them to fight. And so in January of 630, according to these later stories, the early believers around Muhammad went to Mecca, and this was probably a week-long journey at the time. And so here, let's pick up the Surat al-Fatah, which I maintain is the narrative of this journey. And I think it's important to note that in the beginning of this surah, there's a dialogue between the prophet and the tribal forces, the Bedouin, who had allied with Muhammad. And as the prophet is setting out for Mecca, these Bedouin refused to join the procession. And it says in 48:15, those who stayed behind will assert, when you plan to take booty, then let us follow you. And I interpret this verse to say that the prophet had announced that he was going to Mecca for peaceful purposes, that this was a kind of peace procession. And the Bedouin heard this, and they said, well, if we're not going to be taking any booty, then I don't know why we would put ourselves out to go all the way over there to Mecca. And so they said, let us know if next time you plan to take any booty, but we're not on board for this peaceful procession. So again, this seems to me an indication of the prophet's intentions. And then when they got to the believers got to Mecca in 48:22 through 24, it explains that there wasn't any fighting. It says if the pagans had fought you, they would have been defeated. They would have ended up turning tail. But it's implied they didn't. And it says, this is the tradition of God as ever before, and you will find no change in the tradition of God, which I think is a reference to God's ability to make peace where there had been conflict. And it says, he it is who withheld their hands from you and your hands from them in the heart of Mecca after he made you ascendant over them. So I read these verses to say that the early believers came into Mecca in a procession from Medina. They entered into the Kaaba and circumambulated it, and that there was no fighting. And the later Muslim tradition generally agrees with this, but there's an allegation here and there. You find it in traditions attributed to Urwa ibn Zubair, who maintained that his father, al-Zubair bin Awam, carried a battle standard into Mecca, and that he did have a skirmish with some pagans. I can't reconcile this later report, or at least it's recorded much later, with what's in the Quran. It seems to me that al-Zubair was involved in a rebellion, and the family may have wanted to burnish his credentials as though he's the one who conquered Mecca to begin with. But the Quran seems to say that Mecca was not conquered, that the believers just came into it, and that everybody held their fire, that there was peace. And then there's this interesting verse at the end of Surah Al-Fatah, in 48:29, where it says that the believers prostrate themselves to God, as had the children of Israel. So I think this is a reference to a verse such as Nehemiah 8:6 in the Hebrew Bible, where it says that the Hebrews bowed their heads and worshiped the Lord with their faces to the ground. So of course, that's how Muslims also pray. And then it goes on to say that the parable for them in the gospel is as a seed that puts forth its shoot. So this, it seems to me, is a reference to Mark 4:5-8 in the New Testament, about the parable of the good seed and the bad seed, that the good seed fell on good soil and brought forth grain. And I think the purpose of this verse at the end of Surah Al-Fatah is to say that when the believers were restored to Mecca and restored to the shrine, to God, able to do pilgrimage to it and to worship there the one God, that they had become fully the successors of the children of Israel and of the early Christians as the exemplary religious community in the world. As I'm arguing, they achieved this victory through largely peaceful means. They did have to take up arms to defend themselves at some points, but the ultimate outcome was one of peace. And so, if we wanted to accept my narrative of these things and look at principles that could be extracted from it, it seems to me what the Quran is saying is avoid aggressive warfare. Where war does break out, be willing not to be overly suspicious of the enemy and be willing to take seriously peace overtures. And indeed, if the enemy outright sues for peace, there's an obligation to enter into negotiations towards a truce. And that there are forms of opposition to tyranny and oppression of the sort that the pagans were exercising, which are nonviolent. And that's the want of God. That's the sunnatullah, is to promote nonviolent and peaceful resolutions of conflicts. And I believe that's what the Muslims ultimately did when they entered into Mecca. And if you look at the military history of the time, it's very frequent that when the Sasanians conquered a place, they would massacre the inhabitants. And in fact, the Israeli archaeologists have found a village in what is now northern Israel, which clearly had been attacked by the Sasanians and burned. And the archaeologists are eventually going to excavate it. So in contrast to this sort of brutal behavior, the Muslims didn't do anything to the Meccans who had fought them, had killed their friends and siblings, and for all those years in the 620s. There was clearly an amnesty, and indeed, the later Muslim tradition maintains that the Prophet Muhammad bestowed large camel herds on some of his enemies, like Abu Sufyan and Muawiyah. I think, given the state of the world and where we see aggressive attacks being waged and aggressive warfare being initiated, that the gist of the Quran, the teachings of the Quran on these matters, is clearly relevant. And also, to be fair, the provision for fighting in self-defense is relevant. And I argue that although Christian polemicists have made a big deal out of the Prophet's wars, that this principle was adhered to by all of the church fathers. St. Augustine, St. Ambrose, all of them argued in favor of just war and war fighting in defense of the innocent. If you see an enemy coming who might harm women and children, according to the church fathers, Christians must take up arms. And St. Augustine, moreover, even under other circumstances, was a big booster of the Christian Roman army, and said that it was legitimate to fight some wars, even in the absence of an attack by the enemy, if the enemy had broken a treaty or shown bad faith, that would be enough to justify hostilities. So, in fact, I think the Quran's explanation of legitimate violence is less robust than that of Augustine, who seems to me to authorize a lot of wars that the Quran would view as illegitimate. But in any case, this principle of taking up arms when innocent lives are at risk from aggressors is widely held among Christians who were Muhammad's contemporaries. And moreover, there's some polemics against the prophet that Jesus was a pacifist and the prophet fought these wars. But if you read the Christians in the time of war, in the late antique period, they foreground David and they praise his wars. And because they believe in the Hebrew Bible and what they call the Old Testament, that's their go-to exemplar of a just warrior is David. And I think the Quran may agree, because it does briefly retell the story of David and Goliath, and so I think there's a certain amount of hypocrisy among Christians, because very few Christians, aside from the peace churches like the Quakers and the Mennonites, have been pacifists in history. Most Christians have been in favor of war under certain circumstances, and they fought big wars among themselves and with others. So the rhetoric around the principles on peace and war in the Quran in the West seems to me invidious. So I think I've said what I have to say, and I've summarized the principles in the end. So I think it's best if I stop for questions here.
Well, thank you very much for an excellent presentation, very insightful, and in many respects quite novel to me, because there are things that you have raised that I will have to go and read more about it, issues you have raised. We're going to open the floor to questions now. We have about 30 to 35 minutes, more than that, about 40 minutes. Those who have questions, please, as much as possible, type your questions. I'm going to read the first question that's been raised by Andreas Herberg Roth. I don't know if I pronounced the name correctly. He says, or he, I believe it's he, I'm working on intellectual philosophy, and my question is whether you would make a distinction between religion and civilization. In my view, we need a kind of mutual recognition of the civilizations of the world to some degree. I think that a dialogue of the religions of the world is excluding others, whereas the related civilizations are including others. And if I'm not misguided, I think that your talk is more related to the Muslim/Islamic civilization. What is your response, Professor Cole, to this comment or question?
Well, I think those sorts of distinctions between civilization and religion can be made. In social science, there's a principle that you can use a term however you want, as long as you define it carefully. In Muslim thought itself, in the history of Muslim thought, this distinction is sometimes made. There's Al-Mawardi talked about adab ad-dunya wa din. So the adab ad-dunya would be what I would say is civilization, and adab ad-din would be religion. The culture of civilization, the culture of religion, possibly. And Ibn Khaldun, of course, talks about tamadun, or what we would call civilization. It comes from civic in Latin, which has to do with being a city dweller. And ultimately, these ideas go back to the ancient Greeks. So I think the distinction is there, but let me just throw this thought out that even in the terms of religion, it doesn't have to be exclusive. The Islamic religion recognizes Judaism and Christianity, possibly other religions, as having some truth to them from the divine. The Second Vatican Council includes Islam as having some of the light of Christ, and praises Muslims for their positive attitudes towards Jesus and Mary. And by the way, there's more verses about Mary in the Quran than there are in the New Testament. I don't think we have to even see the religion field as necessarily exclusive or alienating. But if we want to use a vehicle such as civilization, that seems to me also possible, as long as we define our terms correctly. The one thing I caution about civilization is that Samuel Huntington's book on the clash of civilizations has kind of ruined the term in some ways for peaceful purposes, because it sets up this artificial division among people based on what he calls civilizations. And it's just wrong, of course, because countries make alliances across what are called civilizations all the time. And, what do you do with something like the Russians backing Azerbaijan against the Armenians, while the Iranians are backing the Armenians against Azerbaijan? So which civilization is taking the side of which civilization?
Okay, well, next question. Anyone who wants to ask a question, they can either write it or raise their hand. Please raise your hand, and then we'll anyone? I don't see a hand raised.
I'm not sure how to raise the hand.
Okay, well, go ahead, Tim.
All right. The Quran, Muhammad's dialogue is with basically 5 different groups in the Quran, if I understand it correctly. And there's a
Could you
chronology.
can you speak into the mic so we can hear you better?
Yeah, I'm on my computer. I don't know. Professor Cole, can you hear me?
I can understand you, yeah.
Okay, all right. He's from America, and that might be
Of course,
why,
he's right
yeah,
next
the
door to
fellow
you.
Americans.
Yeah.
But so there's a chronology there is taking place, and things are being abrogated and so on. Is there a greater degree of I don't know how to say it, harshness towards one group or another? For instance, when he draws attention to the Jewish groups, have you found that, or what would be your understanding there? Because I think it really goes to your topic, to your central thesis. So I'd just be interested in what you have to say about that.
Yeah, thank you, Timothy. It's an important point. And so, I think in the Quran, we have to make a distinction between politics and doctrine. Because I think some verses of the Quran are actually talking about politics and not about doctrine. So in that big conflict between Iran and the Eastern Roman Empire, the early 7th century sources, which are contemporaneous with the Quran, maintain that the Jews of the Near East sided with Iran. There are allegations, and of course you have to take these with a grain of salt because they're being made by, let us say, very committed Christians, but they're alleging that the Jews joined in with the Zoroastrians to overthrow Christian rule and to persecute Christians. And if that's true, and if it's also the fact that the early Muslim community tilted towards the Christian Romans and the pagans tilted towards the Sasanians or Zoroastrians, then it might also be true that at least a segment of the Jewish community in the Hejaz tilted towards the Sasanians and would be therefore political enemies of the prophet. And in the Quran itself, it seems clear to me, and also if we look at the Treaty of Medina, which is recorded much later, but which most historians believe to be authentic. If we look at the Quran and the Treaty of Medina, it seems clear that that the Jewish community in the Hejaz split. There were those who allied with the prophet in Medina, and there were those who allied with the pagan Meccans. And if we consider this split, it makes entire sense of all the comments about the Jews in the Quran, because there are verses that not all the Jews are the same. Some are very upright and are exemplars of ethics to the other nations, and There are these very positive, and then in Surah Al-Baqarah 262, it lists the believers and the Christians and the Jews and the Sabians as eligible for paradise if they believe in the one God and do righteous deeds and believe in the afterlife. So on the other hand, you have in Surah Al-Ma'idah a verse that says that you will find Christians closest in love to the believers, and you will find that the Jews, exhibit enmity, and that makes perfect sense in the framework of the war, because the Jews and the pagans were on the same side, or with the Zoroastrians, and the Muslims and the Christians were allied politically. And so I don't think that verse is about doctrine, because the Quran affirms that in the Torah, in the Jewish scriptures, there's guidance and light. And by the way, it affirms it in the present tense, not in the past tense. And then it has this praise for Jews who are exemplars of righteousness. But at the same time, then it talks about the enmity, I think, of some Jews for the Muslim community over geopolitics, I would argue. And so that's how I make sense of the whole thing. And I think there clearly are diverse views among the Hijazi Jews, and there are diverse relationships between them and the Prophet.
Thank you, Dr. Gold. That was very, very helpful.
Yeah, this has been a discussion that me and Tim we have had for quite some time about the Islamic approach to Christianity as well as to Judaism. So this was also quite enlightening for me. Thank you. Any other questions, please?
Yeah, I have already raised my hand, but
Okay,
apparently,
sorry, I didn't see it. Please
yeah,
go.
as a moderator, you ought to see all the hands up.
Yeah.
So yeah, Professor Cole, thank you so much for a very illuminative talk, and I should also like to thank you for accepting our invitation. My question is perhaps a generalization of the previous question. In order to expand your topic, you are quite understandably concentrated on a number of specific verses in the Quran. But suppose a critic asks you that you are talking about the message of the Prophet Muhammad for the 21st century, and you are suggesting that he has a message for peace for all. If this is going to be the case, then you ought to expand the base of your argument and come up with, if you like, more solid evidence. So this is a challenging question. I'm going to put this to you, that if somebody asks you that from a more general perspective, do you think that the Prophet Muhammad has a message which is fit for the 21st century, and that message conveys the, if you like, a content which is all about peace, harmony, and living together in a very cooperative manner? Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Well, my biography of the Prophet deals with a much wider range of verses than I can in this talk. But here's what I would say is that what the Quran offers, it seems to me, is not pacifism. It's not a dedication to peace under all circumstances, as you have with the Mennonites, but it is an emphasis on the desirability of attaining peace as the end state, and the mechanisms whereby peace can be attained, can be maintained, and can be restored when it breaks down. And I don't think that actually my reading of this is should be controversial, and I think it's very similar to the just war doctrine in Christianity. And I think some of these Quranic principles have been influential in the development of law, and it's not by accident that Mohammad is one of the lawgivers mentioned in the lintel above the Supreme Court in the United States. The Quran has been being read by jurists even in the West all this time. So yes, I think the principles about war and peace in the Quran are timeless. That they still have wisdom for us today, and I think were the world to actually be regulated by some of these principles, for instance, that a suit for peace in the midst of a conflict must be considered, we would all be much better off. And of course, as you say, there are verses in the Quran about war, and verses that say that kill those that you encounter. I think it implies on the battlefield, and these are therefore combatants who've come to kill you. But I think if they're read in context, it's the peace that is being worked towards, and that's again with the Catholic doctrine of the just war, is that war is permissible if the ultimate goal is the restoration of peace. And sometimes people are unjust. If you have an enemy that attacks you, you may have to take up arms or risk the deaths of many innocents. But what the Quran is saying, and I think also the Catholic tradition, is that you don't take arms up to commit revenge, to commit a genocide against the enemy that attacked you. You take up arms to force the enemy back into a position of peacefulness.
Many thanks.
Thank you, Professor Cole, for responding to Professor Pia's question. Next question is from Amir De Martino. Please go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum. Can you hear me? I'm not sure if my microphone
Yeah, we
is
can hear you.
All right. Okay, great. Right. Okay. I just thought I would like to draw some parallel between the methodology of the Prophet unifying Arabia. And we know that by the time the Prophet passes away, Arabia was almost under the control of Medina. But what is the methodology of the expansion of Islam, and to what extent reflects the wishes of the Prophet? I mean, we know for historians that Islam expands out of Arabia at an incredible speed. Can we identify factors, and can we identify if the methodology was a methodology that the Prophet would have approved in that respect? I just want to hear your thoughts on that.
So I should preface my response to your good question, Amir, by saying that I, have
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
I can hear you.
Go ahead.
I have a distinctive view of these matters. The later Muslim tradition depicts the Prophet as a warrior, expanding his territory. And I think, it's been argued that they deploy tropes in his regard coming from even the pre-Islamic poetry of celebrating conquests and wars, and they impose this on the Prophet. But the Prophet clearly instructed his followers to follow an almost a sort of pacifism in the Medina period, in the early Mecca period, before the Hijrah. They were invited to Medina, where the Prophet appears to have been seen as a peacemaker, and then I argue that these wars that broke out with the Meccan pagans were defensive on the part of Medina. I argue that the community, according to the Quran, walked into Mecca in January of 630, and that there was no fighting, and that most of the Meccans then swung around to the Prophet peacefully. After that happened, there was the Battle of Hunain, according to the later sources, and this is mentioned in the Quran in Surah At-Tawbah, the 9th surah, where some tribal forces and the city of Ta'if, which had an agreement with the Prophet, broke it and attacked Mecca, or wanted to, and the Prophet went out with the believers and defeated them. After which, according to Urwa ibn Zubair, the enemy tribe was let go. The prisoners of war were let go. There was a brief siege of Taif, which failed, but then sometime later, Taif came and acquiesced. So Taif was never taken. There was no battle of Taif that produced a conquest. The people of Taif ultimately acquiesced in Islam. The Iranian generals in Yemen acquiesced in Islam without any fighting, and there was a later, threat of somebody up at Tabuk, but no fighting occurred there either. So I can't see that the Prophet ever conquered anything. I think all of the successes that he had in expanding the reach of his religion plus polity were peaceful or consensual. And I don't think that there were any battles in which he conquered anything. There is an allegation in the later sources that there was a battle in Jordan at Mu'tah, but Theophanes, the Greek chronicler, says that occurred after the time of the Prophet, and I believe that is correct. Now, mapping this onto later developments is important, because I think there were very different emphases in the caliphate than there had been in the time of the Prophet. And I don't think they're necessarily contradictory. The Romans and the Iranians fought themselves to exhaustion, and then they collapsed. I don't think there was much law and order in the world, as of 632, when the Prophet, we think, passed away. And so the world that Abu Bakr and Omar and Uthman and Ali were presented with was a world of a power vacuum, a set of power vacuums in which it seems clear there was a revival of Bedouin marauding. There was a lack of law and order. The innocents were being slaughtered. And I personally think that the early Muslims got drawn in to those conflicts because they did have a thriving polity that had its act together, that they had unity amongst themselves. They could deploy men-at-arms successfully. And so I think they got drawn in to local conflicts in places like the Near East and ultimately Iran by this collapse of imperial power. In the later Muslim chronicles, this is described as, a conquering army that's being sent out deliberately from Medina to take over the world. But I think that's a later kind of rationalization of what actually happened, which was almost certainly a series of local skirmishes in which Muslims intervened on behalf of people that they thought were being persecuted, and then established themselves as the authority in that region. And it's important to note that mostly in the Near East, for instance, they garrisoned troops outside of cities. And many of these cities, Jerusalem, Damascus, acquiesced in Muslim rule without a large battle. And then the troops were garrisoned outside the cities. So, you know, from the point of view of the Eastern Roman Empire, the Muslims invaded and took over their Near East, the provinces that had been under Roman rule. But of course, the Romans had lost them to the Sasanians, and they tried to recover them. But it's not clear to me how much authority the Eastern Roman Empire had among those people, most of whom belonged to the Miaphysite branch of Islam, of Christianity, I mean to say, the Miaphysite branch of Christianity, whereas the Constantinople and the authorities were Eastern Orthodox. And it may well be that there were post-Sasanian conflicts in the Near East between the two that the Muslims got drawn into as arbiters. And there's some evidence that the early Muslim polity, the Umayyads, for instance, were remarkably tolerant of various views. And there's there are some Syriac sources that complain about how tolerant the Umayyads were, that they just didn't bother with people's religious views as long as they paid their taxes, and that there were pagans and Jews and Christians, and some of them were friends and going into business with one another. And the Christian monks thought that this tolerance was horrible because it relinquished state power to control people's consciences, which was characteristic of the late Roman Empire. So that's my speculative take on the course of early Islamic history. We don't have any contemporary sources to speak of, aside from the Syriac Christian ones, about the early Muslim empires of the caliphs, or the commanders of the faithful, as they were then called, and the early Umayyads. There's no contemporary material. It's all late. It's all Abbasid, and people are doing archaeology to try to get at it. And just let me leave with this one point, that Israeli archaeologists have been working in the city of Tiberias up at the Sea of Galilee. And what they found was that there was a modest mosque, which seems to be very early, maybe, from the time of the first Muslim conquests in the 640s or 50s, but that it remains the major Muslim building in Tiberias for a century or more, whereas there was this enormous cathedral in the center of the city, which clearly was not bothered. It went on functioning, and so there was a small mosque of these Muslim rulers, which was modest, but the Christian majority in the city continued to go to their enormous cathedral. And as the archaeologists go down in the layers, they're not finding any evidence in Tiberias of violence. There's no ash from a city being burned or that kind of conflict, and the church seems to be entirely intact. So this little glimmer we get of the late 600s, the early 700s from the archaeology that's being done in Tiberias shows a very tolerant Muslim polity. And it's very unlike the images both in the Abbasid literature, Futuh al-Buldan and that kind of literature of the conquest by Baladhuri. And it's unlike what the Christian monks are saying about, who generally have a black legend about the Muslims. So I think we're still at early days in trying to understand exactly what happened.
Well, thank you for replying to our colleague, Mr. Amir DeMartino. Ms. Azam, Rana Azam, please go ahead. Ms. Rana Azam, or Ms. Rana Azam. You have raised your hand. Okay, we're gonna go to another question. One of our lecturers, Sarah Abedi, has asked, you mentioned about the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. What is your understanding of the outcome of that treaty? Thank you.
Well, I have to say I'm a little bit cautious about it because it's not mentioned in the Quran. And I think the Quran is our one sure primary source from the early 7th century about the early Muslim community. But as I said, it seems plausible. The story seems plausible in the context of what else we know. And it does seem to have some resemblance to peace treaties that we know were made in that era. So the outcome of it, I think, depended very much on adherence to its terms. And the later Muslim sources maintain that the Meccan pagans did not observe full compliance with it, which is why it broke down. I think that there may be other things going on as well. For instance, it seems clear from Surah Al-Fatah, at one point it is said that one of the reasons that there was no fighting in Mecca when the Muslims went in was that there were secret Muslims in Mecca. There were tribes that had swung to the Prophet covertly. And of course, because out of fear of Abu Sufyan and others, you couldn't say that publicly. But there seems to have been a strong Muslim underground in pagan Mecca. And it may well be that these kinds of dynamics undermined the treaty, because I think the pagans, according to the narratives we have, seem to have been convinced that they were dealing with Muhammad as equals and that they had as much hope of maintaining control of Mecca as he had of controlling Medina. But it may well be that that there was increased tension in the city in 629 and 30 because there was a shift in the city towards Muhammad, and that may well be one of the reasons for which conflicts broke out, that the pagan Meccans were unwilling to rein in, that caused the treaty to fall apart.
Okay, the next question is Rana Azam. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Professor Cole, for your interesting lecture. I was thinking that perhaps the end result that is ultimately needed here is more of alleviating injustice more than implying peace. I wanted to hear your thoughts about this, and I wanted to highlight that. What is your opinion about the wars that happened in the beginning, Uhud and Badr and Al-Khandaq? There have been some wars, obviously, in the beginning of the Islam. Yes, at the end, maybe there was less of a fighting, but there was in the beginning. So I wanted to hear your thoughts about this. Thank you.
Yes. Well, my reading of Uhud and Badr and the siege of the trench is that these were defensive operations. Sure, they were wars that were fought by the early Muslim community to ensure justice because they were unfairly attacked. But my reading of the Quran is that short of somebody launching an aggressive war against you, the Quran thinks that the way you deal with injustice is peacefully making your point with them. So you argue with them in the best of ways, or you repel evil with what is better. And if you do so, if you repel evil with good and wishing good on your enemies, according to the Quran, you have some hope of changing them, of turning them into your supporters, your wali. And so this ethical teaching of the Quran really, I think it's a very useful distinction that the later jurists made between fard ayn and fard jama'ah, the obligations of the individual and the obligations of the community. I think what the Quran is saying is that the obligation of the individual is to deploy peaceful means to achieve justice. The obligation of the community is to take up arms when they're subjected to an unjust, aggressive attack. But I don't think there's any contradiction between those two.
Stephen Corto, if I have pronounced his name correctly, has asked, as someone who, along with many of my colleagues, find your New Historicism Manifesto thoroughly coherent, compelling, and someone who sees the Quran as an inheritor of a late antique Arabian tradition broadly, it is a welcome contribution. I was wondering if you could briefly speak to where you feel the Quran coheres and where it departs from late antique Neoplatonic texts and traditions. Would you agree that it coheres with the Neoplatonic ontotheology vis-a-vis divine simplicity?
Well, yes. In fact, Glenn Bowersock suggested that the Sabians who are admitted to paradise according to the Surah al-Baqarah may well be the Neoplatonists, because they agree with the Muslims about the oneness of God. I think that there is Neoplatonism in the Quran. I think it's hard to see because of for linguistic reasons, and also, Stephen, I thank you for your praise for that manifesto that I wrote. That the Quran has typically been read as though it's from the planet Mars, as though it's from an isolated civilization, but I don't think the Hijaz was in any way isolated, and my guess is there were people in the Hijaz who still used Greek, as there were in Petra, and we know this from archaeology, and Petra's not so far away. So I think that there were these Greek currents that were flowing through the Hijaz and Jordan and Palestine that are difficult to see, maybe because they're expressed in Arabic. Just as an example, and I know it's a hard case to make, and I haven't succeeded in making it among some colleagues, but the word millah in the Quran was alleged by the great Semiticist Arthur Jeffrey, the Australian, to be a loan from Aramaic, from the Aramaic word melto or melta, which means word. We know that Aramaic writers in Syriac used melto as an equivalent for the Greek logos. So when the Quran speaks of Millat Ibrahim, I think it's saying the logos of Ibrahim, the way, the divine wisdom, and I think it means his monotheism. But logos in Greek was actually one of the words that was used for what we would now call religion. So there was a pagan attack on Christianity that said it was the true word, the logos, the true logos. It meant the pagan religion. So I think there's a Greek, not the Christian logos, which some people have misunderstood me to be saying, but I think there's a Greek sense of the logos in the Quran, and that where we see millah, we should read it as logos, and then I think it clarifies a lot of things if we do so. There are other aspects of the Quran which I think are also Neoplatonic. I think the Neoplatonists' idea of the other world as forms or ideals which get reflected in this world. I mean, I think some of the depictions of paradise in the Quran and of the peace that is in paradise are implicitly Neoplatonic, because I think the Quran has in it the sense that these should be reflected in human society down below. But I think, first of all, somebody more steeped in that literature of late antique Neoplatonism than I needs to take this up. You need somebody who had very good Greek and very good Arabic and could see, the correspondences. But I think it's a worthy endeavor, and some of the polemics in the Quran against kind of the pagan gods are similar to Christian Neoplatonic arguments that we find produced by the school of Gaza, for instance, in the 500s. So all those kinds of possible connections really haven't been explored in any detail, and I'm hoping the next generation of scholars will take it up.
Well, this brings us to the end of our program today. Thank you all for coming. I'm most grateful to Professor Cole for accepting our invitation and for answering all the questions, and also for an excellent presentation, which will provoke a lot of thoughts, a lot of, I suppose, research on the part of our students as well as our staff into the history of the life and seerah of the Prophet. Thank you all for coming, and with this, we end our session. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Cole. Bye.
Thank you. And for anybody who wants to follow up, the Mohammed, the Prophet of Peace Amid the Clash of Empires is the book. It's widely available.
Sure. Thank you.